Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish, and welcome back to English 122, Week 2. I hope you've had an amazing first week of class. Let me tell y'all, I have read the discussion forums for this week, and I am so excited. You all seem like such an awesome group of people. There's a big group of us, so I'm really excited for what we are going to be talking about this week and what we're all going to be discussing and going over. So I'm really excited to see that all take shape this semester. You may not see me this video, and that's okay because we've got a lot to talk about, and y'all didn't come here to see my face anyway, right? So let's dive into this week because I realized my video last week was very long, and I want to spare you some minutes on this week's video. So as I'm recording this, it is Sunday night, so the end of week 1. You'll notice I have the page set in the same view that you all do, so I can see the assignments. Clearly, I've not done my reading response number 1, but hopefully you all have and have turned them in so you can see your assignments. Let's talk about that reading 1 response. I don't want to give too much away in case if some of you have not done that assignment yet as you're watching this video. Hopefully you have, but so far, I've been very intrigued by the responses about Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. I chose that story out of our text because I want to point out something really interesting to me, and that's that Hemingway wrote this story back in the 20s. Like, this story is nearly 100 years old, everybody. Like, it's a very old story. But when you read it, I don't think that. It's not like Jane Eyre or Shakespeare or authors that you kind of know are dated, and when you read their texts, you instantly get a sense of, oh, this was from 400 years ago. Of course it was. I don't get that sense with Hemingway. With his writing, I don't get the sense that this story was written nearly 100 years ago. It feels like something that was written by some hipster in a coffee shop 5 days ago, to be honest. And I think that's because of the style. And we'll talk about style today with Hemingway, but I really think that it's all about how Hemingway uses language and the lack thereof, because as many of you will probably note, we talked about character last week in our lecture video. There's not much character in Hills Like White Elephants. We don't really know the characters' names. We know one girl's nickname is Jig. That's it. We don't really get the sense of a setting other than it's on a train, and we assume that they're in Europe because their luggage has stickers that suggest it. As far as the plot goes, you all can tell me in the reading response, but the plot is very contained to this one moment in time. And with the exception of the operation that's talked about, which I'll give you my take on it and the take of most people, not everybody agrees, and Hemingway doesn't ever confirm anything because it's Hemingway and he's like, I'm the author and I don't want you to know. It's considered that the operation that he's talking about is an abortion, that he wants her to have it and he doesn't think it's a big deal and he's trying to convince her that it's not. Now, whether or not she has the operation, we don't know as the audience. We know that she's very uncomfortable about it and that he's not really seeing why it would be uncomfortable. And so there is this very awkward silence throughout most of the story and this tension that you feel that these two characters that maybe were once really in a relationship have fallen out of it and are not in the same way that they were when they started the relationship. And so those of you that I've answered so far and looked at your reading responses can definitely, I get the understanding that you get that reading it. I just really like the story because it uses the element of fiction in such a very unique and novel approach. It's very minimalist, but it's effective. And I think a lot of writers that try to be minimal aren't as successful with it as Hemingway is. And I just want to give you an example of a story that can be effective and work on many levels, but maybe doesn't use the elements of fiction like we expect it to. So I'm going to respond to all of your reading responses individually, but I just wanted to bring those little points up about Hemingway's work because I think it's interesting. And the story is one of those timeless short stories that I think we can read over and over again and get something new out of it each time. Definitely not everybody's cup of tea, though. So let's dive into week 2. This class goes by so fast, and we're already wrapping up fiction that it blows my mind. Guys, after this week, we are a fourth of the way through the semester, if you can believe it. Insanity. So this video is part of your assignment to watch this week. And then obviously we're finishing up the fiction section by Friday, post in the discussion forum. By Sunday, respond to your peers, submit your first paper. We're going to talk about the fiction exam. We're going to talk about the MLA review. And then there's extra credit, because why not? It's week 2. Y'all need some extra credit, right? So I put this extra credit in here because there's so much to talk about with fiction. And in the fall and spring semesters, we get a chance to actually go over Tweak and Beautiful Boy. But since it's the summer, we just don't have time. So this is extra credit. If you want to do it, awesome. If you don't want to do it, that's fine too. But there's going to be 2 little excerpts. One is from the book Tweak. The other is from the book Beautiful Boy. They're in our resources section, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And then after you read those 2 excerpts, there's just 3 questions to answer. You can submit it in a Word document or a PDF to the Dropbox, and that will be your extra credit. Just to give you a little backstory, Tweak is about Nick Sheff. He was a boy that while he was in high school, he became addicted to methamphetamine, among other drugs, and he goes through rehabilitation. And his dad is the author of Beautiful Boy, and his dad's actually a published writer. And so his dad writes about his experience as a father trying to help his son battle addiction. So you have 2 stories, you have Tweak and Beautiful Boy, that are from a father and son perspective, respectfully, and they both deal with the same issues, but from different perspectives, different points of view. And so I think it's really interesting to see how different their perspectives actually are. So I definitely recommend reading both of these books. I know they just adapted Beautiful Boy into a movie with Steve Carell in it. So I've not watched the movie because I really like the book, and I'm always afraid that the movie won't be as good. But if you have seen the book in the movie, then you'll probably enjoy this excerpt. So in the resources, I'll show you guys that in just a moment. We've got your final draft where you just upload the final paper. I'll talk about this more in week 3, but your first 3 papers, papers 1, 2, and 3, you do get a chance to revise. So if you're worried that this first paper isn't going to be up to your expectations, don't worry. You do get a chance to revise it. So there is that. And then your MLA review and your fiction exam. The MLA review in week 1 of our resources, and like I said, I'll show you all that in a moment. There is an MLA citation presentation. I would like you to look at it to help you with this assignment. We're going to go over MLA next week in week 3, but I want you to go ahead and try this assignment first, just using your knowledge of MLA as well as the presentation itself. So I want to see from a visual learning standpoint what you remember from previous English classes and what you can gather from the presentation that I've included in our resources. And then we will be doing multiple MLA assignments over the course of the semester, but I kind of want to see what you know so far and what you can take from that presentation to help you do this assignment. And then next week, we'll go over the MLA presentation in more detail. But that's the MLA review, and it's an upload file too. There's basically, and I'll show you all what it looks like. There are 4 types of assignments. There's a print book, an online magazine article, a journal article, and a web page. I have given you the information, and I want you to put it in the correct order. So you can take this Word document and you can enter a few times and get a space down here, and you can type it all out, or you can reorganize this in the correct order. I do want to note that this part right here that says italicized, if you were handwriting your answers, you could underline them, but otherwise italicize. So if you're watching this video, I'm going to go ahead and help you with number 1 here. With book titles, you italicize them. So you should highlight the book title. You'll see this little box pop up. You're going to click the I, and that's going to italicize it. And I've just helped you do part of number 1. So then you can either rearrange these parts in the right order, or you can type them out here as an actual citation, whatever you're most comfortable with. And then you'll save it and turn it in. And each of these 4 are worth 5 points apiece. All right? Now, the fiction exam. I know the word exam scares some students, but you should not be afraid of this term, because my quote-unquote exams are not very lengthy. So what I want to show you is that, like I said in week 1, I am not a test taker. So in college, tests freaked me out. So I try to make them as simple as possible. You'll notice that this exam is out of 25 points. There is no time limit. You can take this exam only once, but let me show you what happens. So if I click on this fiction exam to start, I'm going to click this blue box. You'll note there's only 13 questions. It's not crazy. And some of them are multiple choice. Some of them are true and false. Some are matching, and you'll just select one. And then there is a few short answer questions. Okay? Now, when you are done at the bottom, you're going to submit the exam. You're going to press this box and submit it. Once you press this box, your exam is submitted and you can't go back and do anything. So don't click this box unless you are done. Let's say you get to this question 11 and you're typing it out and all of a sudden something happens. You have to go outside and take care of something, but you're afraid of leaving your computer and it timing out. You'll notice this Save Progress button up here at the top. Click that Save Progress. You'll note that it will tell you when you saved and you can exit the exam. Now, when you do this, it will give you two options. You can either go back and resume, which I would recommend if you're not done, or you can finish it and turn it in. So if I go back, it's going to take me back to the exam. Now note, it's going to start over the Save Progress. So if I have to leave again, I've got to save progress again, but I can finish my exam and then turn it in. Okay? So it's pretty straightforward with the exams. I try to keep them all fairly simple, but that way you kind of understand the assignment. So those are our 4 assignments for this week and the extra credit. If I go to the discussion forum, you'll note the week 2 discussion forum. Some of you have already submitted for it. Awesome, nicely done. With the discussion forum, there is a short excerpt from one of my favorite books, which is Devil in the White City. If you've not read Devil in the White City, you need to do so. It's amazing. But this is actually the first chapter from it. So if I click on the necessary supply link here, it's going to take it a second, and then it will eventually pop up something for me to actually read. I'm going to open a new tab just to be sure. There we go. So I opened it in a new tab, and it's a PDF file, so it'll take it a second to load. And then once it does, this is the actual first chapter of the story. So what Devil in the White City is about is it's actually about the 1899 World Fair in Chicago. And it tells you about the creation of the World Fair, which is, historically really interesting. But at the same time the World Fair was going on, there was a major serial killer living near the World Fair, H.H. Holmes. And so most of the story is actually about his murders and his whole spree and his eventual capture. So it's this really cool historical fiction, historical nonfiction that's written like prose. I think that it's fascinating. But this is the first chapter of the story. And so I want you guys to read it and then answer the questions below here. All right. So those are the assignments this week. So now I'm going to go down here. Again, this is the MLA citation presentation. If you've not downloaded it, you can do it for the MLA review this week. It's a lot of files for this week. So here's our 2 excerpts for the extra credit. There's our excerpt from Tweak and our excerpt from Beautiful Boy. If you click on one of the links here, it's going to take you to that PDF. It's going to pull it up. If you are not using Google Chrome or Firefox as your internet search engine, please do so for this class because it's probably going to help you the easiest. But you can see this is Tweak, the chapter excerpt right there. And then for Beautiful Boy, it should do the exact same thing. Yep. And I do apologize for the scan. The scanner may clip a few words on this excerpt. Please do your best with it. I apologize. But yeah. So what we're going to do, and also here's an extra copy of the necessary supply. So as you can tell, I had a little bit of trouble opening it in the discussion forum just now. So if I click this, it's going to open it up too. It does take it a second, so just let it load because it is a big file. But as you can see, it opened just like it did before. Yay. Okay. So we're actually going to go over parts 2 and 3 of the fiction PowerPoint, going over 4 chapters today. So I promise it won't be crazy long. The part 2 slideshow is actually pretty short. Yeah, it's only 5 slides. So chapter 4 talks about point of view. Or chapter 5 rather. Chapter 1 was the preview. Chapter 5 is on point of view, and chapter 6 is symbol. So with point of view on page 179, we get the idea of the narrator, who is the one observing the events of the story. And we get different types of narration. So all of these types of narration kind of blend together, and they sort of overlap in many ways. So if you kind of notice some similarities between these types of narrations, that's okay. That's natural. The first type of narration we have is called limited, and that's where we only know what the narrator knows. So the most common example of this modern day is the Hunger Games. We follow Katniss around, we learn about the districts, we learn about President Snow, but we don't know anything beyond what Katniss knows. We only get her perspective, and we learn as she learns. The opposite of this is an omniscient narrator, a narrator who is all-knowing and is just basically retelling the story for us, events that have already happened. So I think of It's a Wonderful Life. We have the angels at the beginning of It's a Wonderful Life that kind of summon Clarence to go down and help George Bailey. They already know about George Bailey and his whole life, but they are telling Clarence this. So they are an omniscient narrator. Then we have a more modern take on narration, which is the intruding narrator. Narrators that can comment to the reader, or as it's referred to as breaking the fourth wall. And the most obvious example is Deadpool, is the super anti-hero Deadpool, played by Ryan Reynolds. Yeah, he's an intruding narrator. He breaks the fourth wall. He constantly is interrupting the story and plot to say something odd. He's an intruding narrator. Then we have the third person objective narrator, and anything that's objective is factual or matter of fact. I always think of Morgan Freeman in March of the Penguins, where he's just narrating these penguins' journey, and it's very emotionless, very matter of fact. There's no bias to it. It's just stating things that are happening. A documentary type of narration, if you will. Then we have a first-person autobiographical, which is very diary-like or confessional, and the first-person observer, which tells stories that are happening in real time. Think of reality TV shows. Or if you think of Jersey Shore, for example, that's a first-person observer. We see things happening in real time along with our characters. It's very similar to limited. But yeah, those are the types of narration that we have. All right, so we talked a little bit more about interior monologue, things that are happening in the character's mind. Like I said before in chapter 1, we're going to talk about this more in drama, so I'm not going to go too far into it, but our text on page 182 talks about the importance of getting in a character's head, that characters can often tell an entire story from their point of view internally, and where the plot is completely in their mind, there's nothing physical happening. So a lot of terminology here for chapter 6. On page 216, we have symbolism and types of symbols. So there are actually 5 different types of symbols in literature that are used most often, starting on page 216. The first is a shared language symbol, which is a symbol that a culture can identify with. So if you're at a stoplight and it's green, do you have to have the words "go" written on that stoplight? No, because you know that the color green is symbolic with being able to go and move at that light. But if you see it turn red, it's symbolic for stopping. So you instantly stop. It's a cultural marker that we stop at a stoplight if it's red. That's a shared language symbol. Personal meaning symbols are quite the opposite. They're symbols that are only really relevant to the author. So the one that I always think of is that Matt Groening, who created The Simpsons, a lot of the characters in The Simpsons are named after streets in Springfield, Illinois, which I think is a very fun random fact. So the main character, Homer Simpson, Homer is named after Homer Street in Springfield, which is great. So a lot of his characters are taken from street names or places in Springfield where he's from, and just used for that purpose. So it's a kind of a personal meaning to the author. Rich in associations are just symbols that have more than one meaning, so they kind of have multiple meanings to them. A lot of times authors will use things like color to have meaning. So the color red could mean love, it could mean war, it could mean fate, it could mean all these different emotions in just this one symbolic color. Ambiguous symbols don't have a direct or clear meaning, but there's something else there beyond the surface. So if you've ever watched the show Twin Peaks, I love Twin Peaks, but it has a lot of ambiguous symbolism in it that is somewhat left open to the reader's interpretation or the viewer's interpretation. One that comes to mind for me are the aspect of trees. Trees have a very symbolic meaning in Twin Peaks, but it's also ambiguous. It's not just straightforward and easy to understand. You kind of have to think about it, and even then it's often left a little bit up to the reader's interpretation as to what its actual meaning is. And then finally, we have symbols of full context. Symbols don't necessarily have full meaning until the end of the story. So you don't quite get what they represented until you've seen the picture completely. And like I talked about the Hunger Games, the aspect of the Mockingjay is something that by the time you read all 3 books, you finally get a full contextual understanding of that symbolism for that term in the story. Okay. More symbolism terminology on page 220 to 221. We have the central symbol. This is the symbol that a story revolves around. So it actually becomes the focal point of the story. And I always think of, if you've ever watched BBC's Downton Abbey, it's a show about the working class and the upper class all living in the same household in this kind of like pre-industrial, post-Victorian England. And the house itself is a central symbol because it has multiple floors, and it kind of becomes a representation for the class system of the cast of the show. So it's basically a symbolic element of the story that's also a realistic element of the setting. So it becomes a central symbol in the entire show as a whole. Naturalism is the idea of looking at meaning through a quote-unquote raw or unabashed point of view. So I always think of Jack London. He wrote To Build a Fire. He writes a lot of works that deal with nature and the struggle of mankind versus nature and how you survive. And there's a lot of symbolism that he uses that's just based on this idea of naturalism and man versus nature sort of contexts. And then finally, we have social protest, which is symbolism with a political or social aspect. And these 2 stories here, The Grapes of Wrath and The Jungle, are both excellent examples of this on different spectrums. The Jungle is about the industrial labor standards of Chicago in the early 20th century, so in the early 1900s. It's an incredible book, but it's also very, very scary in some of the stuff that it talks about because it's real. For example, people were falling off of catwalks in these industrial plants into like meat processing machines and actually getting put into the food, which is terrifying, but something that was happening at the time. And the president at the time read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and was so moved by the events that he was talking about, it caused political reformation where legislation was put in place to help protect industrial workers. So it's the idea that this one author's fictional story became an inspiration to a political power that allowed actual reform to take place. And it's something that we see now in our own writing on a daily basis. If you've been on social media, you've seen it in action. People's works of art, their texts, trying to make a movement or an action take place. And then you have The Grapes of Wrath, which I don't know if any of you have read The Grapes of Wrath. My friend suggested it to me, and she said, now the ending you're going to hate, but it's a good book. And I was intrigued. And it's a long book. The Grapes of Wrath is all about a family during the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression in the 1920s, migrating from the Midwest to California, looking to find job opportunities and a better life. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go so well. But the ending of the story, I had suffered through the story. I think it's like 600 or 700 pages. I had suffered through it, and miserable things happened to these people. And I suffered through the story, and I'm like, okay, we're going to get to the end. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but I will say this. It's the only time in my life that I got to the ending of a book, and I read the last page, and I reread the last page, and then I threw the book across the room. I was so mad at how it ended, because it just comes out of nowhere and then leaves you in this just weird place. But you know what? That was a few years ago, and I'm still talking to my classes about it. So the author probably got their wish. But it deals symbolically with the suffering of people during the Great Depression and the idea of having to survive, and if you're willing to do whatever it takes to do so. So, more symbolism. That's the end of chapters 5 and 6. Let's talk about the latter part of the section on fiction, which is chapters 7 and 8. Prose on theme and style. So theme. Theme is incredibly important in stories. You have to have meaning or a purpose in order for the story to work. What do you want your readers to get out of your story? When they finish, what do you want them to have learned? If anything, what's the overall impression you want them to have? There are some things to watch out for when you write theme. You don't want to be too abstract. So like on page 262, you don't want to be overgeneralizing where your audience doesn't get what the theme is. They might think, well, what was the point of that? Or they may think it's too vague. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, you don't want to oversimplify things. You don't want to dumb down things for your audience and make them too simple, because then your audience is just going to get bored, or they'll think, oh, well, that's it, and they're not going to feel like it was worth their time reading. And then finally, you want to avoid cliches. So, and this can be hard because a lot of times cliches are important to establish characters or to establish something funny maybe in a story. But you don't want your theme to be like really overly done or cliche, because again, your audience is going to predict it and they might get bored with your story. It won't engage them as an audience. Theme is all about a delicate balance, understanding your audience, knowing what the genre is expecting of you, and knowing whether you want your audience to just feel good reading your story and it not be a complex theme, or if you actually want to challenge them. It's really what you want to make of it. As long as you're consistent and you understand what the purpose of your story is, you'll be all right. Okay, so chapter 8, the last chapter we're going to go over, is about style, the way that the author uses language to create his or her reality on page 309. Style includes ways that you set the mood, the tone you create with the story. If you're going to be a traditional storyteller in the 3-act structure, beginning, middle, end, or if you're going to be experimental, like you're going to go crazy and start with the ending and then go back to the beginning, you have that option too. You as the author have the control to choose what style you want to write in. You just, like theme, want to be consistent. So there's different types of styles, and on page 310 they talk about these 3. There is the understatement, where an author uses minimal or simplistic language to let the readers quote-unquote fill in the blanks. Slaughterhouse-Five is by Kurt Vonnegut, is one of my favorite books, and the use of understatement is so good in it. It talks about war, specifically World War I, World War II, and it talks about these like severely deep and complex issues like death and war and the consequences of it. And whenever there's a big massacre in the story, Vonnegut he just says, so it goes, and then moves on. And it's such a powerful line. It's 3 words, but the way that he inserts them into the text is so powerful that when you get to this moment and you're having this like cathartic emotional release and you're like, oh, this horrible stuff is happening, and then he just says, well, so it goes, and moves on, you feel something as a reader. It's very, very effective. Do not confuse it with minimalism, though. Understatement is using a few words to carry a lot of weight, whereas minimalism is you're not carrying extra weight, it's just literally being simplistic. Formal is the opposite of this. Formal style uses lavish, rich terminology. It elevates the vocabulary. It adds extreme detail. I always think of Charles Dickens, which if you've read Charles Dickens, he loves using words so much, which when you find out that growing up he was paid to write by the word, man knows how to do that properly. He's a very good formalist writer. And then finally, you have the idea of the hyperbole, which is an exaggeration of language to grab your audience's attention. Usually it's used as dramatic or suspenseful text to really like get your audience's attention. We have two different types of style. We have abstract and concrete. Concrete's pretty easy. It's anything you can touch. Any tangible things in reality. So chairs, hair, earth, lava, anything that your senses, not even just touch, anything your senses can come in contact with that's concrete. Abstract, on the other hand, are emotions or ideas, things that are not the same for everyone. So like when you say chair, everybody kind of has the idea of what a chair is. But if I say, okay, what's happiness? Everybody in this discussion forum or everybody in our online class would probably have a different idea, right? We'd all have a different idea of what that is. So that's abstract versus concrete. What you can touch and experience versus things that you think about or emotions, things you cannot touch. We have denotation versus connotation. Denotation, I always remember denotation dictionary. Denotation dictionary. It is just a definition, a matter-of-fact meaning. So if I ask you what is a flag, you could say, and I've got it here on the PowerPoint, a piece of fabric with various colors that's attached to a wooden or metal pole. That is denotation. Straight to the point, what is it? Connotation is the emotional or symbolic meaning that that item carries. So more like figurative. So I could say, well, what's the connotation behind a flag? And you could say a flag can represent a country, a culture, pride, a lawful state. It can represent a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily just describe what it is. It can show what the emotional understanding is of that term. And that's where we get into this whole figurative versus literal. Literal's literally grounded in reality, but figurative is implied, but not necessarily real. So if I'm like, well, figuratively speaking, that means, well, I'm not really saying it, I'm just kind of implying it. Metaphors and similes are terms that are kind of the same, but there's one specific difference between them. Metaphors compare two or more things without using the words like or as, whereas similes compare two or more things with like or as. So if I say, she's like the wind, that's a simile. But if I say, all the world's a stage, that's a metaphor. I feel like we've, as a society, grown to, for whatever reason, more acclimated to use the word like in our vocabulary. I blame Clueless from the 90s, but I blame that movie. But we use the word like a lot. And so I think it's easier for us to come up with similes than it is metaphors. But they're just as equally important. They're both really good ways of comparing things and relating them to something that we're familiar with. Dialogue, we've talked a little bit about dialogue. It's a stylistic choice by an author. You don't have to have it to make a good story, but it can really elevate a story and let you connect more with the characters if it's used properly. The big thing from this slide to take away is how to properly write dialogue. So you notice my punctuation here. I say, hello, she waved to him. Oh, he stammered, nearly dropping his books. Hey. So you'll notice that in all of these parts of dialogue, my comma or my period is before the quotation mark. That's where it should go. Sometimes people write it after the quotation mark and it drives me crazy. Because I'm like, no, it's right before. Put it before the quotation mark. It is part of the sentence. Put it in between the quotation marks. So that's my main takeaway here is if you're writing dialogue, don't forget to do that. Parallelism and sentimentality are talked about on page 312. Parallelism is just a repetition of elements. Usually it's to hammer home a point or to lead to this climactic moment in the story. A lot of authors will parallel things with characters to show growth. So maybe two characters face each other at the beginning of the story and they're inexperienced, and one character beats the other character, but then at the end they face each other again, and the other character wins because they've grown as a person and changed over time, and whatever the case may be. It's just the author uses parallelism to show growth and change in character in the story. Sentimentality is deliberately making you feel sad. I always say Where the Red Fern Grows is one of the saddest stories ever written. It's so sad, and there's so much sentimentality in it. It's basically about a boy that he's raised in a poor family during, the Depression era, and his family, he saves all this money up and gets 2 hunting dogs, Dan and Ann. And without spoiling anything, bad things happen. But there's a lot of schmaltz and sentimentality, and I literally feel like the author just wanted to make the readers feel sad. I really do, because by the end, when you get to the theme, I don't think the theme is worth the story. I'll be honest. But I am a little salty about Where the Red Fern Grows. But authors deliberately want to make you feel sadness or pity for a character. And then you can kind of see that here. So parallelism and sentimentality. This movie right here is called Grave of the Fireflies. It is probably one of the saddest movies I've ever seen, but it's also one of my favorite animated movies. It's basically takes place during World War II, talking about this brother and sister that live in Japan during World War II and kind of them struggling to survive on their own during wartime. It's an incredibly sad movie, but these 2 shots right here are the beginning of the story. Oh, let me go back. Are the beginning of the movie, and these 2 shots here are the ending of the movie. So it doesn't give anything away. You'll find out within the first minute of the movie what's going on, but the author parallels using both of them. And then we have sentimentality over here. So this is from John Wick, which is great. But Keanu Reeves here gets this dog. His wife, at the beginning of the film, she had died of cancer, and she gave him this puppy as kind of like a last parting gift. And without spoiling anything, this dog is only meant to make us sad. But it gets better in the end, right? So in this book, this chapter will talk about irony quite a bit. And irony is defined multiple times in this book because I don't think the authors really understand what irony is. And I get frustrated because we'll go over several different definitions of irony throughout the course of this class. And irony is a hard thing to discuss. It's a hard term to define and encapsulate. But in this chapter, in chapter 8, this textbook basically describes irony as the sad and comic contrast between expectation and the ideal and between the ideal and reality. So it's kind of the difference between what we expect to happen and what actually happens. So in the movie 500 Days of Summer, there's this one scene where our Jordan Joseph Levitt, his character, expects things between him and Zooey Deschanel's character to go one way, and then the reality of what actually happens. So the scene is fairly short, and it's very stylistically different than most movies. But I want to show you guys just an example stylistically of expectation versus reality and how irony is portrayed in this chapter.
That's so nice. Thank you so much. I'm excited to read it. So Tom, what is it that you do?
I write greeting cards.
Tom could be a really great architect if he wanted to be.
That's unusual. I mean, what made you go from one to the other?
I guess I just figured Why make something disposable, like a building, when you can make something that lasts forever, like a greeting card? What?
So yeah, that's the expectation versus reality. And kind of exactly what the textbook talks about in terms of irony. Our character here expects things to go one way, and then the reality ends up being drastically different than what he expected. So on page 315, I think that this example also ties in to what we call postmodernism. And postmodernism is something that's come around the mid-20th century. The best way I can describe it is before we really had ways to categorize literature, in the 1800s, people in Victorian era, they weren't calling their literature Victorian lit. It was just lit. But now, if you go to Barnes & Noble, if you go to any store that sells books, if you go to a bookstore at a college, things are organized by various genres and subgenres. And authors now write knowing kind of what genre their writing is going to be involved in. And that's something that didn't really happen until the mid-20th century. So this kind of idea of postmodernism, this idea of authors having like an inside insight into what they're writing, is something that's relatively new. It can be detached, it can be elusive, it can show kind of sarcasm or nihilism. It's just an author being kind of self-aware of the type of writing that they're creating. On page 331, we have absurd versus surreal, which are very similar terms, so it's kind of hard to find a good example here, but bear with me. Absurd means that elements are out of place in the reality of the story. So I use SpongeBob as an example because we know that sponges exist, we know starfish exist, we know that overalls and hamburgers exist, but all of these things in this picture here are kind of not in what we would assume a normal reality is. They're absurd. Like, you would not normally see a sponge and a starfish in a hamburger car on the bottom of the ocean floor. You just wouldn't see it. It's absurd. Surreal, on the other hand, is dreamlike, like hallucinogenic elements in the story. So I used from Winnie the Pooh the Heffalumps and Woozles musical number, because Heffalumps is kind of like a twisted version of an elephant, but it's very dreamlike, hallucinogenic. You're not going to find this in reality, hopefully. And so yeah, those are our chapters 7 and 8. So yeah, that is our chapters for fiction. I hope that you all enjoyed going over this. I know I went through it extremely fast. Like I said, this class goes by fast, and there's so many examples in our textbook, but I hope that from the readings you're getting a good understanding of what these elements of fiction are. I hope the discussion forums are going to help us get through that as well, and that these elements of fiction help you in writing your first paper. So I have one last thing to tell you all before I get out of here. I thought this video would be shorter, but of course it's not. For week 2 here, I'm actually also taking classes online like you all. I'm working on getting my master's in communication now that I have my MA in English. So I'm actually taking a class this week that is a 1 week long class because why not? So this class is actually having Zoom meetings from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. all week. So I know my office hours are normally 8 to 4:30, but please bear with me this week only. I will not be answering emails or my phone from 9 to 3 p.m. I am going to check my emails every night. I am going to be grading papers from this last week every night. So you will get grades on everything. I will answer your emails. It just may take me a little longer than usual. All right. So if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I hope you all have a great week. I hope you do the extra credit, and I hope that you guys have fun writing our first paper, because so far everybody's theses that I've looked at sound amazing, and I'm really excited to see what you guys all come up with for next weekend. So have a great week, everybody, and I will talk to you all again very soon. Bye.